And welcome. We are recording Poem Stones and Other Little Berries, a Master Gardener Fruit Short Course. My name is Dave Myers. I'm an Extension Educator in Agriculture from Anne Arundel County. And Mariah, thank you for inviting me. And go ahead, Mariah.
Thank you for being here. It's a unprecedented time, and I kind of like not really sure exactly what to do, but trying to do our best to help get everyone going through the course.
Thanks, Ryan. I know we have 18 in attendance right now. I appreciate everyone being in and being patient. We're going to move through the material. We just made a decision to go ahead and push right through the slide material because we are recording. And for those that can't see the material currently, we'll be able to watch the recording. And of course, if for any reason tonight you lose connection, you could go back and revisit the recording too. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Pomes, stones, and other little berries, all the fruit that I think are at least the most important fruit. And pome fruits are what? They're apples and pears. And stone fruits are the cherries and peaches and plums. And the other little berries that we're going to cover will be the brambles, raspberries, blackberries. We'll look at blueberries, strawberries, and we'll throw beach plums in there. So we're not going to cover all the fruit, but I think we'll cover enough detail about fruit production. One thing that I do plan to do, first of all, let you know that most of the slides that you see come out of the work that was done up at Southern Maryland Research and Education Center, projects that I've been engaged in for a number of years. Actually with Ben Beal too, they're right there in St. Mary's County, your extension agent, and Herb Reed in Calvert County. We had the Southern Maryland Vineyard team and the fruit team, and we've been doing an amazing amount of fruit work since about 1998. So I came in extension in 1997, got real busy at Upper Marlboro. So all the pictures that you see will be from that research work up at Upper Marlboro, mainly in the fruit research section. I also do a lot of vegetable research. And so just some other program areas that I'm engaged in, a lot of sustainable high-value crops, no tillage of vegetables, sustainable crop production practices, a lot of things that I've shared with other master gardeners through the years. And I actually started the Master Gardener program up in Anne Arundel County in 1998. And just again, Upper Marlboro Farm, if you haven't been there, we do host a twilight up there in August. So you're welcome to come up and join us to see usually about 35 to 45 different research projects that are conducted up there during the year. Did a lot of work also in specialty vegetables, West African, Caribbean, and even Eastern and Asian vegetables. So the Upper Marlboro Farm, beautiful place. And here's the fruit team, myself, Ben Beal, Herb Reed, Joe Fiola, Chris Walsh. And of course, we were all hired and been working to try to transition tobacco farmers. What I hope to do with the session tonight is take some of that work that would apply to commercial production and make it tailored to homeowner use. So fruit production, maybe using commercial techniques, but tailoring them to homeowner use. Here's just a few pictures. There's me in the peach orchard. We had a beautiful peach orchard up in Marlboro. There's the apple blocks. Did a lot of work. We'll look through that. There's the vineyard team work. That's actually Chardonnay hanging there, and Herb in the vineyard. And here's blueberries. We're in I think our third blueberry trial now. So we've actually had some interesting time with blueberries. There's Ben and beach plums. We'll talk a little bit about beach plums. That's a native fruit. About 2013, 12, around 2012, 13, I put in a meadow orchard. Meadow orchard is an old world use. It comes from the Streuobstwiese word, which is a German word, which means fruit scattered in a meadow. So kind of a romance, if you will, of fruit production. But I took that picture there from Baden-Württemberg, Germany. And not my picture, but one I stole from Wikipedia. But the idea of mixing fruit might not be a bad approach, especially in meadow fruiting for kind of a small scale. And so meadow fruiting is something that I've taken a great interest in and put a meadow orchard at Upper Marlboro, both the tree fruit and small fruit. And so here's a picture of the meadow fruit as it's starting to come into production at Upper Marlboro. It's kind of nice to see the landscape there of a few acres of fruit production. So again, small scale fruit production can be very profitable and very enjoyable. Here's some persimmons and figs up in the meadow orchard. Turned it into hops and bush fruit. And so we played a little around with some of the bush fruit, and here's pictures of putting in um, some brambles. Again, getting them off to a good start. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that in just a minute. But just give you, kind of an overview of what Ben and I and the group has been doing at Upper Marlboro. You can see the vineyard in the background, some brambles here, blackberries, and coming into the fall. And actually, those brambles that you see in that picture was right there. They were the same little seedlings that you saw in the spring. So we can get a lot of amazing growth when we pay attention to detail our fruit production. And then hops, of course, that's kind of interesting. It kind of fits right into the whole new vineyard and brewery. Of course, hops yard in Maine. Can hops grow in Maryland? And so the first hops yard in Southern Maryland was at Upper Marlboro. Our first University of Maryland research hops trial was at Upper Marlboro. And here's the first plants that went in the research program there. There's Ben planting them and my daughter Abby putting them in. And here's me and Ben getting them in. Abby watering them, of course. Talk about that later, but the real success in Southern Maryland, of course, we have long, hot summers, and we're bound to have a drought somewhere embedded in that summer. And I always say I used to be a dairy farmer before I was in extension for the last 22 years, going on 23 years now. I was 18 years as a dairy farmer full time, and so I always thought, boy, if plants could moo, they'd be screaming out there pretty loud about July. So we got to pay attention to water. And of course, our nutrient needs are very important too. So we can't neglect anything if we're going to get our fruit off to a good start. There's the hops by the fall, the first year. And so again, and some research work there on the hops. So again, really is kind of neat to see by the second year producing pretty nice hops at Upper Marlboro. So then by the third year, kind of looked pretty close to what that hops yard in Maine looked like. So I know we can grow hops. There's a picture of hops yard in Maine and in Southern Maryland. So again, I know we can do fine with hops. As far as tonight's material, this slide presentation is available on my website. And of course, we'll have this recording. And chapters 9, IPM, Integrated Pest Management. Pest management is very critical. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through fruit production. I know you're going to have a separate lecture if you haven't already on IPM. And chapters 10 is your pesticide chapters because you can't neglect controlling pests. And so again, pests need to be controlled in fruit production. Small fruit and tree fruit, chapters 18 and 19. So that's your text to read. I know eventually you have to have an exam to be a master gardener. So yes, enjoy this lecture this evening, but also make sure to read those chapters pretty thoroughly in your course manual. It's also very important to have your own textbooks. Here's Temperate Zone Fruit Pomology by Neil Westward. These are college texts from the University of Maryland. I took a course with Dr. Chris Walsh years ago. And then Fruit Science by Childers I took a course with Westwood books with Chris Walsh when I was in graduate school. And in undergraduate school, I took a fruit course. And Norman Childers' book there was the textbook back in around 1982. But a couple of texts that I always have. I'm a weed scientist and agronomist by training, so I always have my weed books and, of course, insect books. Davidson Alliance book is probably one of the best ones. So these books, it's always good to have text and books. And of course, with Google now, we can good Google search engines. Always put edu after your search, so that way you'll hopefully get reputable searches out there. It's really important too to have industry catalogs. And when I say industry catalogs, I don't just mean the yearly variety showcase. I mean, a lot of times they have good reference editions in what they would call grower catalogs and reference guides. And so ask specifically when you work with a company like ACN, Adams County Nursery, or Starks or Norse, specifically request their grower catalogs and reference catalogs and materials. Much more detailed in information, especially things like trellising, choosing the appropriate pollinators, and those things very important. And let's see. And I am going to watch the chat, so maybe you can send the chat. If you do, click all participants, then everyone can see it. If you don't have that option, at least put, hope that you should have that. I do see some of you are now using all participants, so hopefully you can put that in chat, and if you want to keep me, I'll pay attention to chat as we go through. Extension bulletins are very important. They're very technical, typically meant for commercial growers, but there's a lot of good information in there when it comes to fruit production, timing, different stages of growth, key pests, and those kind of things. So extension bulletins can be very informational, and a lot of times they're very up to date, yearly or within a few years. Try to keep them up to date. Question I always ask of any audience. I actually do teach a course at the University of Maryland every semester called Pesticide Use and Safety. And so, do we need pesticides? And I know that, everyone has a little different opinion about this one. But when the University of Maryland Educator and Master Gardeners, you will be educators. Opinion is not important. Science is important. And so pesticides are a very important part of the science of agriculture because we always are under a threat, no different than being under threat right now with coronavirus, right? So it's good science requires us to have good pest control measures. And even in organic production, certified organic, they use, National Organic Program uses pesticides. So we're not, pesticides are used in all aspects of agriculture, whether it's conventional or organic. And so, in fact, organic production, the National Organic Program, and why I mention this with fruit production is because fruit is some of the hardest and most difficult to produce because of the pest, the amount of pest, and most likely disease and insects will be the number one problems with trying to be successful in fruit production. There's nothing worse than growing fruit and losing fruit without having some type of control measure. And so I would recommend a softer, reduced to organic chemical approach, but certainly they need to be timely and are an important part of the process of growing fruit too. What do you think? What's the current level of pesticide use in or organic certified fruit production in the U.S.? What percent are we at of the total U.S. production of agricultural product? What percent right now? You can go ahead and type it in the chat box really quick if you think you know what percent that might be. We were at 1 to 2% in 2003. Where are we at now? Arundel predicted by 2013 using USDA agricultural data that we would be 10 years, of course 2013 is almost 10 years from now. And so I see Douglas puts 14%. So we actually plateaued in around 2008. That gives you a little bit of a clue. Arundel predicted we'd get to that by 2013 we'd be at 5% of total production agriculture. How would you know? The Economic Research Service, USDA, does a pretty good job about every 5 years putting out a pretty good evaluation of just where we're at. And so most people think that we're relying more and more on organic production, and we are, but we're still not very significant, especially when you look at fruit. If you look at fruit production, I don't know if you can see grapes there. It's about 3.97%, so about 4% of our grapes are organically produced. 2.29% of our citrus. Apples are at about 4.9%. But overall, when we look at everything, all the food production in the U.S., we're still only around 4%. And so 96% of what we still eat, and a lot of that is fruit, is still conventionally produced with conventional pesticide approaches. And that's because of the difficulty. If it was easy, we would be doing more, believe me. It's not a very easy thing on a large scale to do. It's much easier on a homeowner scale. So that's why I think master gardeners and homeowners should be working more towards reduced risk and organic approaches because it is much easier. So anyway, it is nice to know. It's nice to know these things and to kind of understand what drives production in agriculture and how we're doing our best to reduce those risks with pesticide use. There's a really neat document, 50 Ways to Treat Your Pesticide. If you just Google that, write this down, 50 Ways to Treat Your Pesticide, Google that, and you'll get a real nice resource. I think it's a very good stewardship document on how to promote and use pesticides very judiciously and hopefully. And I tell my students in school that if you want to pass an exam, it's a great way to study and go through these 50 questions, if you will, about 12 pages, as kind of a great way to brush up on pesticide science and really pest management science. And the reason why I say all this is because I think with fruit production, we want to be successful. And success means that we at least protect enough of our fruit with a pest management program that at least allows us to produce a little bit of fruit to enjoy, right? I will tell you as we go through which of the fruits are easiest to grow. Maybe you already know which ones, and maybe you have some experience. Maybe tell me in the chat there which fruit is the typically the easiest. Which one would you start out or recommend that you start out? We'll see if you agree with what I say later. There are some interesting things out there that interesting information out there. One of the ones that I typically also like to, when we talk about pest management, food production, is this article by Council of Agricultural Science and Technology, issue paper number 55, the contributions of pesticide to pest management and meeting the global need to feed for food production by 2050. So again, and I'm hoping that homeowners, and in fact, we were thinking today, I was talking with somebody today about the coronavirus, and maybe there will be a resurgence in gardening this spring. Might have a lot of time on our hands. Might be a good thing to get kids out and do. So maybe gardening might be a real resurgence right now, recognizing that we have more control over what we eat at a local level. And so I'm hoping that that is the case, inspires more agriculture and more gardening and more production. I see Wendy says strawberries might be the easiest to grow. Well, think about that a little bit. Of course, as master gardeners, when it comes to pesticides, protect yourself as the Master Gardener program, make referrals, HGIC, Home and Garden Information Center, to other faculty, to use University of Recommendation bulletins. Don't try not to discuss pesticides as far as making recommendations. Take them to different sources for that. And always, if you do discuss a pesticide, make sure the label is in your hand, because the last thing, remember, that's a legal document. There's no mistakes that can be made here. And so promote IPM, promote personal protective equipment, and promote organic and reduced risk pesticides. Again, those are good things from a homeowner standpoint. Try to learn the chemical common name. So what's the chemical common name for Roundup? The common name for Roundup. You know what that is? So again, it's always nice to know. Instead of the brand name, everyone knows Roundup, but it's really nice to know the chemical name. That tells you so much more. Remain unbiased at all times. You are educators for the University of Maryland, responsible for scientific fact, not personal opinion. Well, I can't just drive that home anymore. I think I'm really proud of our Master Gardeners. They are educators. You are educators for the University of Maryland. You're volunteered. And thank you for your service. But you do have a heavy responsibility and burden to be a scientific educator, right? That's what we're founded on. That's what the college is founded on. And the last thing we want is our reputation of yourself and the university taken to task, right? Remember, no one knows everything. I've been doing it a long time, and when I get stumped with a question, the first thing I say is, "That's a really good question, and I'm going to think on this, or I'm going to find a little bit more information out before I answer that one." So again, it's always good to duck and dive sometimes and find the right response. As we think about fruit production and later think about, fruit does require some pesticide applications. Typically in our area, we have high humidity, high disease pressure, plenty of insects. First of all, we choose the fruits that we can grow with and use the least amount of pesticide approaches, but we also want to think about if we do use treat every one of them with respect. All of them, whether they're organic or conventional, are still a pesticide, and we want to make sure we and everyone that we work with understands that. Of course, there's so many other tactics that we can use besides pesticides, and that's IPM. I'm sure you had a lecture on that, or will have a lecture on that. I just want to make sure you understand IPM is very, very much used by farmers. And they use an economic mathematical model of IPM that most people don't understand. And if people talk about IPM, they really don't fully understand how to practice it. So I want you to be aware that it is based on pest density over a model, over an equation where the cost of control, pest density equals the cost of control over the value of the crop times the damage done. And it can be set up at economic injury level and a threshold of application. So farmers can absolutely know when it is responsible to make applications. And so again, this is amazing science. And I just want you to understand that we can absolutely know when it is critical in production to use a pesticide. And it's a lot different based upon what our goals are. If we're making growing apples that essentially have a high value, like an apple that we're going to put on a fruit stand and everyone's going to pick through, then we know that we typically won't tolerate more than 3 fungal spots on that apple without rejection. Now, most homeowners that grow apples will take a lot more fungal spots than that. And so, again, we have different thresholds based upon the economic outcome of that. So applesauce apples, on the other hand, we would never spray for fungal spots, okay, because fungal spots have no bearing on the surface of that apple as to the quality of the applesauce. And so, again, thresholds are based on the value of the crop and the cost of control. Of course, if we have insects like this, who knows what this is? That's anyone know what that is? Ladybug beetle. Yeah, that's the larval stage, right? Very good. The ladybird beetle's larvae, and it's eating an aphid, and they'll eat its weight in aphids times 10 in no short period at all. So we recommend that basically when we see one of those, we reduce the threshold of spray by 10%. So again, that's pretty incredible by seeing one ladybird beetle out there when we're doing our pest observation counts to make a recommendation for spray. We're going to be very careful if we see those out there to calculate those beneficials in there. Of course, here's a parasitic wasp laying the egg on a poor aphid. And of course, that aphid, there's a healthy aphid and an aphid that's been swollen, basically mummified. We call them aphid mummies. And little escape hatches where the wasp exits out and starts. You can understand that a pesticide in this dynamic system will more than likely kill the beneficial quicker than it will kill the aphids. So we need to pay attention. In fact, 70% of pest regulation comes from natural predation or natural pathogens. And so again, that's pretty incredible. So if we have a very diversified agricultural system, which we can have in a garden and a small fruit and meadow orchard, we can a lot of times reduce greatly the need for pesticide applications and use much softer pesticide approaches. All very critical, right, to wanting to have successful fruit production in our backyards. So let's think briefly here about what I would say general site selection and preparation for fruit production. Location and suitability, that's very critical. We're going to look at the lay of the land, the orientation, the layout. Typically, we're going to want to plant all of our fruit in a north-south direction just to maximize the amount of sunlight and to reduce the amount of shading across the rows. That only time I would not say north-south would be if that north-south has to be running up and down a steep slope. We would be much better than to orient on the slope, on the contour, so perpendicular to the slope. So slopes kind of outweigh, if they're steep, that north-south orientation. But for the most part, that north-south orientation on a gradual slope would work just fine. Here's a nice example of that. Preparing an area to put some fruit in. Actually, at Upper Marlboro back in 1998, I was working up this little area that had been in corn and then soybeans, and now it's going to go into fruit production for about 12 years. Ended up going into fruit production for about 20 years. But you can see, first thing you do is kind of lay out. And you see the little stakes there. You can see the little look like popsicle sticks there. That's how I spaced out the trees and get ready to plant an apple and peach block down through these rows. Of course, this is the perfect time to do any soil fertility and amendments. And then later on, we're going to establish sod in between those rows. And we're going to get that area around those trees weed-free, right? That's very critical. Of course, preparation of land. I'm a strong proponent of reduced tillage and cover cropping and all those techniques to really help us boost up that organic matter of that soil to make that soil preparation right for a crop. And so there's a lot of different techniques that we might use in preparation of land. Here's tillage radishes, Dr. Ray Weil at Beltsville. This is on Black Friday a few years ago. We were right there after Thanksgiving. I guess that's called Black Friday. Thanksgiving Friday. And here we are, dug a pit. These radishes were planted in September, or the first week. And here they are, all the way, the roots went all the way to the bottom of that pit in just that short period of time. That's a daikon radish or tillage radish. So we don't need tillage if we can use the appropriate cover crops. Of course, remediation is really important. When I talk about remediation of orchard replant sites, a lot of times we make the mistake of putting the same type of tree, whether it be a stone fruit like a peach or a plum or a cherry, right back in the same spot where a peach or a plum or a cherry was, when we'd be much better off to rotate into an apple or pear, to switch up at least those major families of trees. If we're, but often what happens is, grandma's peach tree was there and we always love getting peaches from it. And when grandma's peach tree dies, we typically don't want to put another tree in there except a peach tree. And when that happens, we got to pay really specific attention to site remediation. So anytime we're replanting and we want to put within the same family, the stone fruits in the same vicinity, or the pome fruits, the apples and pears, we really need to think about remediation. What we're really concerned about is a complex of diseases and nematodes. Nematodes are microscopic parasitic worms in the soil. Most of them are beneficial, but some of them are parasitic to plants. And so this is Dr. John Halburn's work out in Big River, Pennsylvania. And you can see here a really interesting picture. These are about 5-year-old apple trees that had been replanted in a previous apple orchard. And everywhere the trees are, I think I can get my pointer here so you can see my error. You should be able to see the error now. Every tree here in the row, you can see how thick those trunks are. These were in the old driveway, which means that would have been where the old sod was, right, where no trees were. But everywhere where they put the trees in the old tree row, almost no growth comparison to the very spindly apple production. After 5 years, these things should be in full production, and they're never going to reach maturity. They're going to typically kind of wither and die before they ever come into production. So, and here's even worse with this plum orchard that had gone back into where peaches were, and 70% tree loss to stem pitting. Again, this is a complex of disease and nematodes. Now, you also notice that this plum orchard behind here is perfectly fine, same varieties. But what's the difference between these two blocks? Anyone have any idea? You can see several blocks is actually peaches and plums in an area that was all previously in peaches, and they did certain treatments to some of these blocks where the trees are fine. What treatment do you think they did? What remediation? What would farmers do? Any idea? Any farmers out there? What would they have done? I don't see anybody typing yet. They would have fumigated. Fumigation. Isn't that something? Now, could I recommend a homeowner to fumigate? No, I would not. But I would recommend if you were a peach grower and you want to go back into peaches, that fumigation might not be a bad idea. Or you could take 2 years. Best thing probably do would be plant an apple tree instead of a peach. But if you wanted to put that peach back, and make sure you had a peach where grandma's peach tree was, then what you would do would be some type of remediation. A bioremediation is the term. And it's a cover cropping sequence. It typically takes 2 years. And manure might be a good part of that, Douglas. Again, manures, you're trying to really stir up the biological activity. At the same time, using a crop like rape, in this case it's Dwarf Essex rape, and then flailing it creates its own biochemical isothiocyanate, which, as it sounds, is quite deadly to most parasitic nematodes as well as to complexes of disease. It's actually a natural fumigant. And so we can then flail that in and then follow with Sudex, or this is millet that I grew in Upper Marlboro. And so millet or Sudex, sorghum, Sudan grass, again, these are techniques that we can use to prepare that ground over a period of probably about 2 years of cover cropping. To make sure we reduce all that disease nematode complex, and then we can successfully go back in. So it's no different than the cultural rotational controls that our farmers would use, right? And so again, we're understanding the dynamics of these systems, and they are amazing. Here's some work at Upper Marlboro. I did allowed no-till into millet and different cover crops, rye and just different covers. And here's actually looking at some turnips and Swiss chard production, but that could easily have been tillage radish. We could have followed with strawberries down that row, or planting of raspberries or brambles. And so again, these are very good techniques. And guess what? You don't need all that fancy machinery. Here I'm teaching some master gardeners at Upper Marlboro how to use, in this case we used a little bit of millet, and then we're going to go ahead and put in a fall radish crop, and this could be tillage radishes, and then we can come back. And so I'm showing that it's very easy to had that millet growing, come in the fall, and with a mower, a little scratch area with its very simple planter, be able to plant that tillage radish and think about those cover cropping systems on a very small scale. Preparing to plant. Planting method. Remember I showed you that picture with those little sticks? Now I'm going down with a auger, and I'm only going to take the auger to the depth that I need for my roots, no deeper, because I don't want the hole to kind of collapse in. And so I'm going to go down. In this case, I'm getting ready to put in 84 peach trees and 96 apple trees, and I had all those holes drilled within about an hour and a half. So again, equipment and planting method, kind of preparation makes it reduce labor. All those things are very important to make it fun. We want to make it enjoyable. We want to make fruit production enjoyable. So again, fairly small. There's an acre of fruit, fairly quick to put in. And so, but the last thing I'd want to be doing out there is digging those holes by hand. So again, nice to have a little bit of machinery, rent some machinery if you can, reduce labor, make it enjoyable, of course, make it safe. Next thing you want to make sure is that you have water capability. Watering capability is almost as critical as anything you can do. Remember I said if plants would move, they'll all be hollowing by the 1st of July, maybe sooner. And if we can not allow new leaf tissue to push, if we don't see it stop in July, then we typically in Southern Maryland can fruit the second year. At least that's true on stone fruits and the brambles and the blueberries and even the grapes. If we can push enough growth and we don't let them stop growing during the summer, the trick is you can't let them stop growing. They won't start again until late fall if they start at all. And so we've got to push it through that hot summer period with water. And if we're willing to do that, we can fruit most successfully by the second year. I will say apples and pears will typically need to the third year, and you're still going to have to push them hard with water. So that's always critical, watering and the capability of watering. And when I mean push them, I mean they can't go dry. They can't be that calf out there hollering for even one afternoon. They've got to have moisture at a level that they can actually bring moisture into that plant to keep growth going. But if you commit to that, and I'll show you some pictures of how amazingly that fruit production can be. There's almost always water where we fail. And the other thing is reducing weeds. We have to have a weed-free zone. I'll show you pictures of that too. So weed reduction and all the nutrients and all the water will go to that tree or that young vine or bramble, and then you'll have success. So just always remember that. And you always typically want to have about 2.5 foot on all sides of that plant. If it's a circle, that's fine. If it's a single plant, if it's in a row, I like to have a 5 foot wide kind of strip where we put all those roots in there, and those plants will meet, the roots will touch and adjoin within that 5 foot area that's weed free, no competition. All the water and nutrients going right to that, building that root zone. Deer control, can't even forget that for the first minute. You want to have deer control in there the week before you plant, and you want to train your deer, okay, not to go into that area. So, successful planting, tree placement, very critical. When it comes to tree placement, the first and number one rule is you have to think about pollination positionings. You got to position pollinators. So, just to make this simple, I think we'll go through pollination right now all at one time. Apples and pears require 3 varieties that have pollen that's shed at the appropriate time. So flowering has to occur simultaneously. So you have to look at pollen compatibility charts and choose 3 apple varieties and 3 pear varieties that have compatible pollen shed, and then they have to be somewhat in vicinity of each other. Now, when I say within vicinity, within a half acre or an acre of each other is fine. The bees will move around. So again, you have to have 3 separate varieties that shed the pollen at the simultaneous timing. That's for apples and pears. So if you do have a single apple variety, what will typically happen is you'll get parthenocarpus fruit production on typically a biennial year, maybe every 3rd year you might see fruit. And so you get this very uneven, plus a lot of fruit drops most years because of lack of pollination. Now with cherries, you have 2 types of cherries that are typically thought of. We have the tart cherries and the sweet cherries. And tart cherries are self-fruitful. So if you want just one cherry tree, that's fine. Just make sure it's a tart cherry, like Montmorency. Now, if you want to grow a sweet cherry, that sweet cherry will have to be cross-pollinated. So they have to have two varieties at least. For those two, they don't self, they have to cross-pollinate. So sweet cherries cross-pollinate, tart cherries self-fruitful. Plums are very interesting. The damsons and the Methleys, Stanleys, they typically are self-fruitful, so one of those is fine. But if you get into some of the European and Japanese sweet plum varieties, sometimes you have to be very specific to the plum varieties as to what's required for pollination. Peaches are self-fruitful, all peaches, and peaches and nectarines are the same thing. I don't recommend nectarines because they're just too difficult to grow because of disease pressure. But peaches, which are still very difficult, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they're still self-fruitful, so one peach tree is all you need, and you'll still have plenty of fruit set every year. The grapes are self-fruitful, so we don't have to worry about pollinators or pollination varieties. Blueberries, they can be self-fruitful, but blueberries need to have some pollination to have large size. So if you want large blueberries, you have to have they have the same like apple. They have the same 5 locules and seed cavities inside the blueberry. You need 5 seeds that are a little bit. You can always tell when they're fertile. They're just a little bit larger inside. So when you bite into a blueberry, you kind of have that little bit of a graininess of about 5 seeds. That means you're going to have successful in sizing that blueberry, so that you need some fertilization from varietal differences there. And again, blueberries are a little easier to get to cross-pollinate because they tend to bloom pretty simultaneously across the varieties, much different than apples and pears. But you do need pollination with blueberries. Strawberries need to be pollinated, but they will self-pollinate. But the bees have to be there to actively move the pollen back and forth from the flowers. No varietal differences is required for the pollination to occur. And let's see what else. Beach plums are self-pollinators, and the brambles are self-pollinators. I think that covers the fruit we're going to talk about tonight. And so, again, pollination is key to success. And so, again, strawberries, if you're going to grow some patio strawberries, you better make sure there's some bees out there buzzing around, to make sure those strawberries have a chance to mature, be pollinated. Avoid J-rooting. By all means, what that means is we just make sure when we have that hole, we don't jam those roots. We don't have this little small hole. We jam the roots down, and the roots basically come up, and we kind of jam them down, and we got this kind of a J-shaped root. That tree will never grow, or bush. What we need to do is think about positioning those roots where they need to be. And that's another key part about planting is knowing how to place roots when we plant them. We want to always take the largest root, and typically that coincides with the largest scaffold on the tree, and point that into the wind. So we have the best anchorage in that northwest direction. We always want to make sure that the roots go out. And for the stone fruits, they tend to like to be shallow, so we're going to go on a slight angle out in all directions, and we're going to make sure that the tips go all the way out and basically are straight in a kind of a diagonal away from the trunk. The apples and pears tend to be a little more tap-rooted. We're going to point them down a little bit more, as well as grapes, a little bit more down, and they're a little bit more feathered. But the idea is make sure we orient those roots where they want to be. Blueberries want to be up in that top 3 to 4 inches, almost perfectly between 1 and 6 inches deep, in kind of a layering fashion. So knowing how to place roots is absolutely critical to the success of that bush, and the time that we take in that is absolutely critical. Firm that soil, exclude all that air. Those roots are placed perfectly, no J-rooting or curling up. It'd be better to cut them if they're too long, or make the hole bigger to make sure we get this perfect root orientation. Initial head cutting. I don't know if you can see it right there, but I actually put that peach in the ground tree. It's a feathered whip. I like whips. I like the cheapest tree you can buy, a whip. I really don't like feathered whips, so I'll take them. But the main thing is they're small enough and juvenile enough that I can make a heading cut. On peaches, all my stone fruits, I want my heading cut at 24 inches. I might cut half that tree off on that heading cut. But what that does is it puts my scalpel limbs down at the ground, which means I'll have a pedestrian peach tree for 7 to 8 years, which means I can harvest the fruit from ground without a ladder for 7 years, because I'm going to get 24 inches of growth with a 45-degree angle scalpel limb, which will put me out to the point where I hope to be about 7 to 8 years before I get on the ladder, and I'll be producing all my fruit. Heading cuts, extremely important. We make 28-inch heading cuts on apples and pears on a feathered whip. and 24-inch heading cuts on peaches and cherries to get that early low scaffold development. When I talk about scaffold limbs, we're typically talking about 4 to 5 main branches that are going to come off. We want them to come off at 45-degree angles to the trunk. That's why heading cuts are so important. Now, if you get a full tree and you got to buy a full tree and it's already been done at the nursery, then you're not going to make a heading cut on that because you're going to have no juvenility down there at 24 inches, right? So, we mentioned this before. We're in Southern Maryland. You're right down there in St. Mary's. Pretty red down there. Hot, long growing season. Pretty nice. Carolinas. Think Carolinas, and when you think St. Mary's County. And ignore your northern neighbors and the northern textbooks. All the fruit textbooks were written for the north, and so we're going to fruit the second year because we're going to push it through that hot season with plenty of water and no weeds, right? And we're going to enjoy the success of a long, hot growing season in Maryland. So here's my picture again. Irrigation is essential. Figure out how you're going to water. Trickle irrigation is really key. Remember those heading cuts of those trees? You can see me there. That's growth. All that growth is from that head cut peach in 1 year. By the fall of the year, that tree is off. Those peaches are off to a really good start. That's from that little twig we put in the ground to that tree at the end. Here's a picture of a transition where I came out of the peach orchard and decided to plant apples in a fire blight study. And so you can see where we took the peaches out, we tilled up the ground, pulled the roots out, tilled the ground up, and then in the drive row we put the apples. So not only are we going to different, from the pone fruit to a stone fruit, or stone fruit to a pone fruit, now we're going to really, we're going to get down the middle. So in chance you can see now here's coming back 2 weeks later. You notice that transition, really nice transition there. We go from soil and kind of weeds there in the center. We go to, now I've got some good weed control around my young apple trees. 2 weeks later, you can see the grass coming up. You go out another 2 weeks, and you can see I've successfully controlled the weeds in that 2.5 foot, 5 foot wide total, 2.5 foot on each side of those apple trees. They're starting to bloom. I'm going to pull those blooms off the apple trees. I'm getting a nice turf, and by the time I get to the second year there, you can see I've got a nice orchard there. With good sod and well-maintained apple trees. So the non-bearing years, we're going to control weeds, and we're going to apply some disease and insect management. Very minimal. We're going to remove all the fruit first year. We're going to prune out any damage, and we're going to train based on those training systems. I don't know if you can see there, but there's real faintly, there's those apple trees there before I made the heading cut. And you can kind of see them standing in that slide there. And so here's pruning. You probably had a lecture on pruning. Pruning's all about developing that scaffold limb to orient those limbs so that there's no shading. You don't want one limb ever over top of another limb. You want to kind of open up that solar, think of a solar panel. Prune to control size, prune to promote sunlight, and prune to develop the proper canopy size in relationship to trunk and leaf number of leaves per fruit. It gets pretty scientific, but it is essential to health. There's so many different root stocks when we get into apples, and so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the what I call the bud nines and the G16s. These are the full dwarf. I think from a pedestrian standpoint, these full dwarf supported trees fits really well. Recommended apple varieties. I have that home fruit guide that has kind of an outline for a lot of these slides that we're going to go into now. And so that was one of the documents that was shared by Mariah. And also I have that my fruit spray guide that has both organic and conventional products listed. Main thing about that is it's really good about timing from a multi-fruit standpoint. There's a tree fruit and small fruit side to it. Varieties, there are Scab Immune, Liberty Priscilla Prima. Of course, Stamen is the Maryland variety. My varieties are still the varieties that we think of when we think of Northeast apple production: McIntosh, Yorks, Crown Empires, Cortland, Stamens. Those are the apples that made the Eastern apple market. They're still my favorites for our area. They require less spraying. I would throw maybe some more recent ones that I might throw in there might be Gala's a really good one. Braburn's pretty good. So again, there's some newer ones, but I would still stick with the old standards, the Imperials, the Empires, the Cortlands. Again, bred for our area, they do quite well with reduced spray approaches. Um, Again, the traditional, what we call apple tree, which would have been a freestanding apple tree without support, would be the Heineke spread in the head. It's the idea of kind of 45-degree scaffoldings, kind of grows out like a Christmas tree. We cut, we head, and we spread. We kind of constantly move the cone of fruit out in kind of a pyramidal type fashion. I will talk about the whites, why I whitewash the trees. That's really important. In fact, I think I have a picture here in just a minute. The fire blight is, anyone know why I put the whitewash on the trees? That's actually latex paint. I highly recommend that on fruit trees. Our grandparents knew how to do that. Somehow we've forgotten important things about fruit production. But if anyone knows, write it there on the cap. Key pest problems of apples and pears, fire blight and scab. That's the big problems. And that's the reason why, especially fire blight, we don't have an apple production region here in Southern Maryland. Our apple production is in the Piedmont, where they're less likely to be overcome with fire blight. In fact, up until recently, our full dwarf trees, we could expect 50% death of our trees within 5 years, even with a modest fire blight program. So again, not something that makes it very conducive to production agriculture. But that's changing. We now have Geneva rootstocks that are looking more promising. They're out of Cornell's breeding program in Geneva, New York. And key pests for apples and pears. Plumpkin curlew is a pest for every fruit. And that's that picture here. You see the little weevil-like up here on the surface of it. Looks like a peach. And it makes a little cut there. All right, looks like maybe it's a young apple. Makes a little cut. Now, we'll talk about that, but think about that one. That's plumpkin curlew. And, of course, we typically have some type of maggot for most of the fruits, and that's a picture of an apple maggot fly. They look like a house fly, except they have very beautiful patterns on their wings, these fruit fly maggots. And then, of course, we have fruit flies, and we have other insects, too, scales, mites, aphids. Again, key pests that we need to be concerned about. Here's a picture I took when I was in Kazakhstan. I took it because that's the Almaty, Kazakhstan. That's the Kazakh range there, mountain range. And that's where apples were considered the origin of apples. And that mountain right there, that range behind there is the origin of apples. And I actually met some researchers that were, while I was working there, I actually had a chance to go in there and teach some horticultural students in Kazakhstan and Almaty and at the Grand University. And we were talking about, the apple region there in Almaty, Kazakhstan, as being the origin. And people still go back and search for resistance from those selections, if you will, of wild apple varieties. Of course, here's an Upper Marlboro. This is a system that I think is pretty good for a homeowner that wants to put in a small apple block. We can put in a lot of apples in a small area. Typically 14 foot wide between the rows, about every 6 feet. We can put an apple tree. We can use a very simple conduit or some kind of trellising system. And we typically do subtle bends. It's called slender spindle. And we're trying to develop a fruiting central leader and then a fruiting table of scaffold limbs. And I've actually got some weights on there to train those young apple trees to be able to hold a tremendous apple load. Here's Nittany. Nittany is a variety out of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, it does not like this system. And so what's happened here is I've got, once I put that subtle bend in that tree, it automatically reduces apical dominance. So it's all hormonal control of the tree. And eventually these other ones want to become dominant. So now I've got 3 dominant central leaders. I have to make a decision. 2 of them have to go. And so again, I'll probably take the strongest one, lay it over, cut the other 2 out, try to put weights back on those scaffold limbs to get that branch angle down, nice and flat, 45-degree angle at the branch angle. That's what I'm looking for. Of course, this isn't honeybees, right? You don't carry honeybees in the back of your car in a bucket with a towel over it with your dog in the back. Anyone know what kind of bees I might be bringing to the orchard? It's certainly not honeybees. The Osmia species from Japan You can rear them in these bamboo shoots. In fact, they're already out. There's a few of them hanging around on Ron and on the towel there. And you can see now that I've got, here's a real nice picture. You can see I've got the trees there. Apples are in full bloom. I've got the king flowers are all showing. Got the honeybees have been in there for about a week, or not the honeybees, the Jasmine species bees. And you see I've got good weed control. I've got the trunks are painted white. Trees are trellised. And so we're into production year, third year here with these apples. So they really are amazingly in production very quickly. I took this picture. I managed really hard to capture this little rascal. It's the horn-faced bee, Osmia conifrons. It's a solitary bee, very docile, very active. You can see this is a real nice picture of the king flower. When an apple blooms, there's 5 blooms. 4 of them are considered tertiary, which means they'll basically bloom later. Unfortunately, what will happen is all of them will typically pollinate, and you'll end up having way too many apples. And so, but it's nice to have those tertiary blooms in case a freeze comes along. And so we'll go ahead and let everything pollinate, and then we'll worry about thinning, right? And we can thin by hand very easily in an apple orchard. We can do chemical thinning too, but small orchards, hand thinning is fine enough. And here you can see we've got more of the tertiary blooms coming in with the king flowers, all set there. Remember I said those pictures. This is again looking at the apple orchard. Coming around to the peach orchard here, 96 apple trees, 84 peach trees at Upper Marlboro. You can see these were actually planted in that spring. And so we have a full orchard coming in by the fall. It's not even fall yet. And you can see I have no weed competition. We had trickle irrigation in there, and those peaches are now ready to make into an open center. When I talk about stone fruits, I like open centers. So we're going to cut the central leader out, and we're going to have 4 to 5 scaffold limbs with a very nice open center, and that's the goal. And we want our scaffold limbs about 18 to 20 inches off the ground. That's why we make the heading cut at 24 inches. And so you can see how phenomenally they grow. And again, we're in peach production by the second year. We'll have 20% crop on those trees by the second year. Full crop on those peaches would be 3 bushel at that spacing. And so again, that's our goal with peach production. You can see me in that picture. That's a few years ago. And we're spraying. There's all kinds of sprayers. But fruit spraying is very important, so I don't want to understress that. Of course, I had the advantage of having a nice cab sprayer. Again, took a picture here spraying the peaches as it got a little bit older. And the peaches in there about the size of a walnut now. And I'm going to go ahead and put some cover sprays on right to get to that high quality fruit. And so I did develop these spray sheets to help our growers. I do think they're pretty helpful to our small orchardists especially. And maybe even our homeowners that want to get into a little bit larger fruit production. Again, very, very helpful. I do put organic substitution charts in there for those that want to do it organically. When we think about the spraying of our fruit, we need to be thinking these aren't countries, FRAC, IRAC, and HRAC. These are resistant action committees. And so basically we had to think about rotating those chemistries. So regardless if it's organic or conventional, the chemistries are sometimes very similar. And so when we look at the exact chemistry, and we need to rotate chemical families, it's very important and very strategic to not having resistance development in this. So I want to stress that even as a homeowner, we all have to pay attention and be a part of not allowing resistance to develop. So homeowners can get, just like farmers, can kind of get in the rut of wanting to use the same chemicals year after year. And I'm going to say mix it up. We got to have very good strategies out there to reduce and manage resistance. We're all kind of in this together. Very important. Again, here's that organic substitution, conventional products, very similar chemistry a lot of times in the organic products. Again, we got some pretty good weed control out there too with some product like Avenger. Thankfully, of course, thankfully we don't seem to get this snow thing anymore, but it is nice that we have winter, and winter is a very good time for us to kind of clean the slate, to kind of reduce disease inoculum, to reduce, if we do a good job with sanitation, leaf removal, cutting out cankers and cleaning up, we can come back in the spring, especially with some good dormant oils and things of that nature, come back fairly clean in the spring, and that's always wonderful. I've been to a lot of areas in the world, in the tropics and areas and things in Africa where they don't have that winter period of nice break, if you will, in the life cycle. And they said it's a constant, continual process of trying to balance that without having kind of be able to kind of have a reset. So winter's our reset, and it's a great time. I think we're all ready to get anxious to get back out there in the spring. It's good to know all the villains here. We got all the different things we want to watch out for, pay attention to. Any one of these can really be damaging to our success. You can't buy decon anymore, but of course, I just wanted to stress the importance of mice control and using bait stations and loading up enough bait whenever you see mice activity, because they will girdle the tree. It's really important, especially if you use mulches, to move the mulch back away from the crowns of the plants. I'll basically come back to bare soil in the wintertime because that way you can kind of see mouse activity. They will typically burrow just below the soil layer, especially below the debris and mulch layers, and stay unnoticed and be actually girdling your trees just below the soil line. So you want to pay attention to that, rake back those. If you're using mulches, make sure they're back away from the trunks. And if you do see a lot of mouse activity, bait for a period of time is a very quick way to drop that population. Again, now with cage bait systems and things like that, we can do it without impacting pets or children or anything like that. Of course, this is deer control. With the deer, a single strand, deer typically like to go under a wire quicker than they'll go over a wire. So put the deer strand, all it needs to be is one stinger wire about knee height. So you don't really need to make it very high. And you want to make sure that you take a little tin flashing and put some peanut butter under there. And they'll train themselves, they'll self-train when they smell that peanut butter and put their nose on that. That's a great way to teach them to respect that area. Once they know that electric's there, they're less likely to come anywhere near it. That works pretty well for 1 to 2 acres for keeping deer out. Larger than that, it gets much more difficult. So you might be better off doing small electrified areas around your acreages. Here's a picture of the apples blocked, and I had, as the tree started to decline from fire blight, you can see I lost about 50% of those apples over the years, and which would be typical and basically anticipated. This tree is actually dead, doesn't know it. So the fire blight has gotten into the plant, streamed all the way down, and actually kills the root before it kills the top. And once the root's dead, it's all over for the tree. And again, it's called fire blight because it looks like somebody torched the tree. You come back, you notice it wilting. The next time you come back, it's all brown and basically looks like it was hit with a torch. So fire blight. Very destructive. It's a bacterial disease. We actually treat it by using streptomycin, a product called agromycin. It's the same streptomycin you might take for a sore throat because it is a bacterium. So we actually spray during bloom with streptomycin. The only other thing we can use during bloom that works is copper. And so we'll use copper and streptomycin for fire blight control. On organic only, you have to get an exception to use copper. There was sometimes exceptions for agromycins, but that's kind of that's up in the air. I don't know if that's the case anymore. Anyway, that's a really critical issue. Pears are less subject to death than apples from fire blight. And if you really, if there's where sometimes the full semi-dwarf or trees might be better than the full dwarf trees, because the semi-dwarf trees are less susceptible to death by fire blight. They'll still get fire blight. You can cut it out, but they're less susceptible to death. This is a total loss in this picture here. So that's about a 6-7 year old orchard that's totally lost to fire blight. So again, that's the reason why it's limited to fire production here. This is something I did Upper Marlboro. This is a technique called ugly stub. We're trying to cut ahead of the bacteria as it's streaming down the phloem. And we can see that by discoloration. So we're trying to cut the clear wood. It's somewhat futile and unfortunately typically doesn't lead to very good results. The interesting thing about the fire blight evaluation at Upper Marlboro is the varieties that were typically the mainstay of the industry here were the ones that had better than 70% survival. So it doesn't surprise me that Cortland's, Empires, Yataka is a cross with Red Delicious as well as Sun Fuji. So we got Red Delicious in there, and you can see they did better than I would expect. The newer varieties, Pink Lady or Cameo, Honey Crisp, kind of the rage right now, look pretty sad where the older varieties did better. So I still recommend what would be a traditional apple for our region. and that's why I chose the ones that I chose to share with you. The Here's Jonathan Coster, and again, beautiful apple. You can see right there. That's like 48 pounds of apples. No, wait a minute, 65 pounds of apples on that tree. That's a bushel and a half of apples in that poor little tree. It's only about 4 years old. So again, amazing production. Ginger gold back here, same thing, loaded down. That's how we can really grow. We're in the business to grow fruit. Think about that. You can grow 600 to 1,200 of those trees per acre in some of these systems. And if you can get a bushel and a half acre per acre, what little bit of an acre you need to produce an incredible amount of fruit. Geneva 16, these are in the new fully dwarfed trees that are somewhat tolerant to fire blight, and that's what I did Upper Marlboro, was do a G16 study, and I did get better survival. In the 5-year study at Upper Marlboro, thanks to Adams County Nursery, had some really beautiful apples there. Here's Blossom Strike of fire blight. I'm going to take and cut the clean wood, and hopefully take my pruners in there and cut the clean wood, hopefully avoid that going down into the phloem, into the trunk. And then trauma blight is later on. That's typically hail or wind. So we have it at bloom time, and we can always have it anytime we have a thunderstorm, severe thunderstorm, we can get trauma blight. We need to be very diligent about cutting those out. Over the 5-year study, I actually had 80% tree survival on the Geneva 16s. These are the root stocks out of New York, out of Cornell. And so I was pretty happy with that. I think we have a chance now. I want to share something with you. This is very interesting. It looks at establishment of organic protocols in apple and Asian pears. And this is the Asian pear, and this is apple, Liberty apple. And we're looking at Liberty Enterprise and Gold Rush because they are somewhat scab immune. And then Olympic, Nataka, and Nataga, these are Asian pear varieties, also somewhat scab immune on other diseases. And then Gala, Fuji, and Cortland, kind of standard for our region. And highly recommended commercial varieties for our region. The interesting thing is they grew the orchard conventional, and then later on they halved it, and they went with an organic material approach and a conventional material approach. This is over at the Y Research and Education Center. And the first thing you'll notice at the bottom of this slide on the organic side, it says continue. And you'll notice the date was about a month behind, which means there was actually many more sprays in organic production. And people think, oh my goodness, how can that be more? The problem is these products, if we get more than a ½ inch of rain, they need to be reapplied. They're all protectants, and so we only have activity with just on the conventional side. Just the advantages of the surfactants, the stickers and spreaders, gives us up to about an inch of rain before they're washed off. And so even if they're based on similar chemistries, it's that ability to stay on and not be washed off that gives us greater protection. So we actually spray less, and of course these are very expensive products on the organic side, so you have to get recouped. If you look at it from an economic standpoint, you have to recoup. And it really is economics is the reason why we haven't advanced more organic production. It's all about economics as well as labor issues and that. And so we have to pay more if we're going to get more into organic production in the U.S. Pay more and do much more time and labor into production. That's not typically the way we're driving things. We're typically driving prices down in agriculture, not the other way. So it is very interesting to think about. Here's the picture of the Cortlands on the organic side. My favorite apple is Cortlands, and you can see that unfortunately they have a really interesting little scar on them, and this scar is caused by an insect. Remember that little insect I told you? Remember? Who remembers what it is? It's the main reason for fruit to fall off a tree. The only reason why fruit falls off the tree, and it's really the same reason. When someone calls me up and said, all my apples fell off the tree, there's only 2 reasons, and they're really both the same. And that is, they were never pollinated properly, because an apple has 5 locules. Remember I said it has like a star on the inside. If you cut it tangentially, you'll notice that there's a star, and each one of those stars typically has 2 or 3 seeds. And if you don't have those seeds in there, those seeds are signaling the tree hormonally, and they're saying, your seeds are out here and they're viable. And send all your photosynthetates out and fill out this apple and protect your seeds for survival, right? So it's all about survival of those seeds, hormonally signaling back to the tree. You'll notice that on these apples that are misshapen, about 2 of the locules essentially don't have any seeds, because if they had seeds, they would have been completely filled out. And they also have a scar on there from that insect that I was telling you about, which means something laid an egg there and probably crawled in there and ate those seeds. And what's in there right now is a pupated insect called a plum cucuрлio. And the only reason they didn't fall off the tree is because they still had more than 3 locules, or at least 3 locules to hold on, which means the tree was still willing to invest. If it had already lost seeds in 4 of those 5 locules, those apples would have been aborted chemically by basically abscisic acid produced by the tree. It's all biochemical, and it's amazing. And everything we do in tree production is hormonal and manipulation. And so again, just fantastic. The biochemical realm of this is just, to me, the most fascinating. And of course on the Cortlands over here, you see there's no egg scars, which means the imidan treatment, excuse me, was successful. And so there was an insecticide over there on that conventional side that was really important. Organophosphate imidan was the one that controlled the plum cucuрлio. Over here, the plum cucuрлio successfully hatched and came in and killed those seeds, and now is sitting in those apples. And typically, most people will reject them. You can they're perfectly fine to eat, so there's no problem with that. So from a homeowner standpoint, as long as they stay on the tree, you probably did okay. But for sale purposes, no one's going to buy those apples, right? Of course, here's the Nataka organic pear, Asian pear. And you can see the organic side actually looks really well. And that's where that meadow orcharding kind of comes into these. Not that the plum cucuрлio won't lay eggs on those Nataka organic Asian pears. It's because they preferred the Cortlands, right? So they went over there and probably saw that the timing was right to be in the Cortlands and not in there. And so by having multiple fruit, I think we lessened the likelihood of, or at least the preference, if you will, of at that time, of the cucuрлio, plum cucuрлio. That's the insect. So when we think about the pome fruits, really similar to the apples, Mangus, Moonglow, Potomac. The only difference between we saw all those different seedling rootstock options on apples. We really don't have much options on pears. We typically, all of ours are standard pear trees, are standard on domestic Bartlett seedlings. Now they are doing some interstem dwarfing on pears. I'm still not a fan of those. I think those interstems, basically, I still go back to standard domestic Bartlett seedling as being the best way to go. But they are big trees, and they do require co-dominant central leaders. And so every pear tree that you see out there that was done right never ceases to amaze me. Our grandparents knew how to do everything right. They knew that you grew 2 central leaders that would be co-dominant, essentially in competition. And that's how you would try to keep the size of the pear tree within reason. Eventually, of course, they get quite large. But there are some Fireblade immune varieties, Magnus, Moonglow, Potomac, again, that I would typically recommend. And so we typically have, again, we talked about pollination and the different things before, the same disease problems. Here's a picture of Mount Hood in Oregon. In Oregon, this area, this right in here is a very beautiful vineyard, and it actually is the pear valley. By most people, would consider this one of the best production of pear regions in the world. I went out there a few years ago and presented that little multi-fruit spray sheet, and I remember kind of getting jeered a little bit by a colleague out there in Oregon. He says, we only spray 8 times here in the Pear Valley of Oregon. And, well, how can I argue for him? Well, I said, well, I'll take 17 sprays in Maryland. And anyway, you can imagine, I didn't tell him I was going to go out and take a visit to the Pear Valley, but you can imagine what was on my mind. In fact, I no sooner than got off the bus at a rest stop, and I looked down the pear orchard, and there's somebody spraying. I wanted to run down over the mountain there and holler at the fellow, but I felt better of it, and I figured they'd leave me behind. But anyway, I had a chance to meet with some growers there, and it was a beautiful pear production region. And you know what I was going to ask? How many times? What are your pests, and how often do you spray, and what makes you decide, when and how to spray? What's your IPM strategies? And of course, here's some beautiful Bartlett pears, and here's some scarlet crimsons, and again, just really beautiful production. You can see how they kind of have the co-dominant central leader. They have hedging machines. These are fairly old trees. They're about 12-year-old pear trees that you're looking here. And again, very productive. And of course, completely blemish free and insect free. And so as soon as I had a chance to talk to the grower, he pondered a little bit and he said, yeah, I asked him about fire blight and parapicilla and, all the different problems he had. And he said, yeah, we have all those problems. He says, even though it doesn't rain here, we have high humidity. So imagine that, an area that doesn't rain the whole time the pears are on the tree, they're irrigating and essentially have high humidity. But it's that high humidity that's problematic. And so if we didn't have any rain washing off our pesticides, I think we could use a lot less. But he said he actually thought he used about 12 sprays, which meant he used about 5 sprays less in the area that didn't rain. And so I'm thinking, well, I'm not thinking too bad of our growers right now. They're pretty much they're kind of right on par with the amount of rainfall that we get, But they did have some beautiful pears. There's some 59 cents a pound. That's a few years ago, but still they're pretty cheap out there on the market. Stone fruit, the peaches, nectarines, plums, cherries. Again, when we think about the peaches, they're always going to be also on a standard tree. Typically, they're going to be on a Lowell or Halford seedling. So your peaches and nectarines, of course, nectarine is a peach. It's just a smooth peach. They're going to be on a Lowell or a Halford seedling, which means that we really size control. Here's a beautiful picture of a tree. It's about 12, I'd say probably 12, 13-year-old tree. And you can still pick probably 75% of that fruit without even getting up on a 3-step ladder. So again, to me, that's beautiful. That was in Prince George's County. That is the old Cherry Hill Farm. You can see how low those scaffold limbs are. Just a really beautifully done. And so peaches, nectarines, excellent. Really, they are highly productive. And we still have, the standard varieties, the Flamin' Furies, the Red Havens, the Lorings, beautiful trees to grow here. The plums are all typically going to be grafted onto Marabella. Again, anything grafted, when we plant it, I'll show you a picture here later, all the graft units have to be a fist height out of the ground. So one thing I've talked about placing the plant. The other thing we have to really recommend is the graft unions on all the grafted plants need to be out of the ground by at least a fist height. That way we make sure we're rooting on the grafted root and not the scion, which is the variety, will actually root, which will basically there'd be no reason to have a grafted tree at that point. So peaches and the stone fruits, I like to see the cherries, the peaches, the plums in this open center. We cut the central leader out, so this is a tree going into its second year. And again, very interesting way of doing that. Big problems with our stone fruits. In fact, I say the brown rot and peach scab makes peaches the hardest to grow. So I don't typically recommend someone get into peaches until they've had success with other fruit. So remember when I said which one would be the easiest? Well, peaches are the hardest because of brown rot and peach scab. Rusty spot is actually powdery mildew of peach and peach canker. Problems if we get our peaches in a low area where fog settles. So almost all fruit we typically do not want to put where fog typically settles, the low area. We're going to see a lot more cytospora peach canker if we're in a low area. So again, peaches by far the hardest to grow. I would recommend the stone fruits. The easiest would be cherries, or actually plums. Plums and cherries are probably about equal, but plums might be the easiest to grow of the three. The only problem with plums is because we typically get late frost, we only have a success of about 1 in 5 years with plums. And so the damsons and the Methleys, the Stanleys are our best plums. Because of that, they tend to bloom a little bit later, but still not late enough for most years to have damage. Although recently we haven't had those frost in April. So again, we can't always predict that. So plums are very difficult. Cherries probably the most likely for us to grow with a little bit more reduced spray. And of course, of the stone fruits. And then absolutely peaches are for the experts. I don't recommend them until you've had some experience with spraying. The big problem with peaches is scale. Of course, plum cuculio, fruit moth, peach tree borers are another one that's really critical. And I don't know if you saw the recent legislation with chlorpyrifos. That's very difficult for our farmers, especially our peach growers, because that's the only effective peach tree borer control is trunks drench with Thorsban once a year in the fall. It's the only one we have that really works. And so without that, there's a lot of people thinking about peach orchards. So again, that's very difficult for us until we come up with something different. That Thorsban, that chlorpyrifos is very critical. So there's consequences when we decide not to have particular chemistries. And so again, that consequence might be we will see very little interest in planting peach orchards from a commercial standpoint. There's my boys. They just got finished putting some white paint on all those trees. And I don't know if you can see off in the distance there, but every one of those tree trunks has a fresh layer of latex paint. And someone asked me a few minutes ago, why would you put paint on a tree? And what do you think? The main reason, and I'll tell you why, the main reason is because what might happen in February, especially in the end of February with snow on the ground. That's the key. It's the key to why you put latex paint on. And so if you went out there with snow on the ground on a nice, bright, sunny afternoon in the third week of February and put your hand on the side of the trunk that's facing the sun, how warm do you think that trunk might be? Yeah, sunscreen. It's liable to be up to about 75 degrees, maybe even 80 degrees, even on a fairly snowy covered ground in February on the side of that trunk. It'll feel like a hand warmer. You go on the opposite side of the tree, it'll still be 40. So what's happening on that tree when that high temperature is hitting on that tree? It's about the same time we're tapping maple syrup, right? We're going to get a really high run of phloem and xylem up through that tree, sap, and what will happen when it goes back down to 15, 20, 15 that night? That tree will split wide open. And so we absolutely use it to keep that temperature from climbing up and reduce the likelihood of splitting. Our grandparents knew that, and very few of us know that. In fact, most ornamentals need that protection on those southern exposures. And so if we see trees out there splitting in the landscape, shame on us. It's because we have lost our common sense that our grandparents knew. They used to use a mixture of linseed oil and chalk or talc and make up their own whitewash, if you will, and do that on all their trees to make sure they didn't split. They would do it on all the trees, on all their maples, especially young trees, right? And so very critical. Also, I think the latex can give us a little bit of borer protection as well as scale protection. So I always paint up and into the lowest scaffold limbs, sometimes come up into the limbs if they're good, if there's still quite a bit of sun exposure. So that's something we should we need to do more of it. And I do not and never use Roundup around anything you plant. And if you do, make sure it's shielded and make sure your latex really heavy. Because if you get any Roundup at all in those trees, it'll be 2 to 3 years before you grow out of that damage if it doesn't kill the tree entirely. So again, that's and I don't know if it protects the rabbits. I don't think rabbits care. They'll chew on anything. Here's the V block. You can see how well I painted those scaffolds as they've gone into maturity. Again, they're still subject to that splitting. And so I kept keeping very well latexed, and I do think that protects from borers, other insect scales, with that real thick, heavy latex application repeated every year, going into the winter, right, every fall. Very important. Of course, you can see how well I kept that weed free. Remember, the stone fruits are fairly shallow, and so you cannot have weeds in there. You cannot have direct competition in that, and that zone should expand out as the trees size. So what might start as a 4 to 5 foot weed control area, I might expand that out to 6.5 feet by the time I get into peak production, because I want all the water and nutrients in that to go to that tree, right? And again, that's at bloom time. And there's my son. He's actually got 3 children, and he's a police officer in Anne Arundel County, homicide detective. But he's kind of grouchy looking there as we're getting ready to prune, because he knows how much work it's going to be. Pruning is how we size control. In this case, it's this peach block. And you can see all the prunings there. We did quite a bit of pruning. We typically want about 24 inches of new wood each year to fruit on, and we want to try to minimize that growth so that we get 24 to 30 inches of new growth each year, and at the same time avoid shading and competition of the limbs again. So very critical. Pruning is very critical. You see again the nice control there. Of course, that's pruning on all your peaches. It should be as late as possible. So you want to do that right till you get to tender bud swell. So this time of the year right now is probably optimum for most of our stone fruit. Apples and pears, we can prune them as soon as the leaves fall off. And we typically prune our grapes in the spring. So again, right before the buds break, before they swell to and become too tender, we can damage them at that point. So this is a good time of the year to prune grapes and peaches. Do our apples and pears as soon as the leaves fall off. It's a good time to do that. Put some copper on, some lime sulfur, really sanitize. Again, really nice things to do during those winter periods. There's a superstition that says horsewhip your peach trees before breakfast on Good Friday to ensure a good harvest. Well, that's something you do in Georgia. You don't do it in Maryland. What they're talking about is blossom thinning. And so, of course, Good Friday occurs at a different time every year. But the tradition is we do need to thin our stone fruits. There's no doubt about that. And so, but we do not want to thin blossoms. We want to wait till the fruit's set because we could get that frost in April. And then we want to make sure that we still have fruit on the tree to thin. So we'll wait until June drop is when we typically thin our peaches. And here's a perfect example. It's not uncommon to knock more than half the fruit off a tree. So here's a perfect example of all that fruit, just about the size of, what would that be, about maybe an inch in diameter, 3/4 to an inch in diameter fruit. The interesting thing about the fruit, you want one fruit about the span of your hand, so about every 6 inches or so. You want it on a good scaffold or a good branch limb. You want to position your fruit about 6 inches apart. Now you'll typically have 2 or 3 fruit that are hanging right together. Now they all have hormonal, based upon size and strength of the viability of that seed. They'll have different levels of hold, if you will, to the tree. And so what you typically do at June drop, you'll notice that some of them will, if you tap a limb, will fall off. And so you wait for that period of time. You go out, right around the first week of June, and you take, I like to have a piece of hickory stick or strong maple with a piece of rubber hose on it and give a rap on a limb. And a few of them drop off. I know that they're hormonally, those are the weakest ones held hormonally. So that quick rap will drop off those weak fruits, and I'll whack each limb and drop. Then I'll go in and detail the large. I'll take the smaller fruits that are left out and leave the largest ones, right? And so that's how we thin one every 6 inches. And if we do that, we get those nice, beautiful peaches. If we don't do that, we get these small little peaches that are basically half seed and a little bit of flesh that never really gets too sweet. So we have to thin, and we do it by hand, but we let Mother Nature do its thinning first, and then we come in and do our hand thinning. Here's those. Actually, I didn't talk about V trees, but that's a different training system that I was doing at Upper Marlboro. And you had the V blocks much closer planted than the open center. I typically like 24 feet by 20 on peaches, maybe even 28 by 24. It might be even better. So give wide berth for your peach trees. So if I would actually put them 28 foot wide, 24 foot in the row, would be typical for my peach varieties in a nice vigorous soil site. Gives them plenty of area to grow. These are V trees here, so they're much closer together. So again, apple trees depend on the rootstock as to how you space them. And if you're going to use those full dwarf trees, typically 14 foot between the rows, 6 foot in the row. Here's my boy. Again, he's helped picking peaches. He's got a few children of his own too. He's also a police officer. And of course, I put my children here because my daughter now, she's graduated college. And so again, it's interesting because they really enjoyed the fruit. I think fruiting really is part of family and things. And of course, the kids are out of school right now. We probably ought to get them engaged in gardening. And wouldn't it be nice to take them out in the orchard now? There's Abby. Of course, she gets a little older. Like I say, now she's finished college. And so we all enjoyed those fruits. That's the fruit we picked at Upper Marlboro. Again, 17 sprays will get you that. That's not what I would typically recommend for the homeowner to even try. That's why I typically say. So I'll tell you what's the easiest fruit to grow right now. The easiest fruit to start out with is blackberries by far. If you can grow blackberries, you're ready to graduate. And then the next one I would probably recommend would probably be blueberries, as long as you can pay attention to the soil preparation that's required. And then maybe it would be plums, followed by cherries. Then I'd say apples and pears. So again, it's kind of a graduation. Of course, grapes, I would throw grapes in there pretty early too. Grapes would come in there around blueberries. So again, it's kind of willingness to address the disease and insect problems. And you know what? It really is important for us to think about that, addressing that disease and insect problem. Here again, picking those peaches and this actually got thinned out by frost more than I would have liked in this picture. And when that happens, you get these about softball-sized peaches. I don't know if you've ever had one of those, but they're unbelievable. And so if you ever had the opportunity to eat a fresh ripened softball-sized peach, you kind of understand what I'm talking about. It is something to really remember. Here's some training systems. I'm not going to get into that for time right now. Look at some pictures about disease management. Dr. Lalasat Norman from Rutgers. He's got some really nice pictures of fruit disease. I just want to show you when I talk about the importance of disease management. Here's just beautiful pictures of brown rot on, again, the hardest fruit to grow, peaches. And you can see that they mummify, and these mummies won't fall off. In fact, even by the next time the tree flowers, you've got spores on these mummified fruit. I believe that peach tree could be blown out of the ground and roll around like a tumbleweed, and those mummified fruit will still be hanging on there. They have to be physically knocked off, and it's not easy. And then you got to cut out the canker wood, because everywhere that fruit rotted, there's a canker that's also producing spores. And so brown rot is just something that just escalates, and then it's just a perennial scourge that has to be controlled by sanitation and by removing all that disease, and then by fungicide applications. Peach scab is no different. Typically, we're talking about a peach about the size of maybe a marble, and then we're going to see when infection occurs, and then maybe even after a shuck split, when it first comes out, very small peach, that's when infection, we won't see that infection for 45 days. The first show up on the peaches looks like somebody took a black magic marker and just touched your peach. But then they'll coalesce and more of them will appear. Eventually that peach will split open and rot, and you'll never get a peach to eat. So peach scab, very devastating. And it cankers on the branches. Here's rusty spot, which is powdery mildew of peach. It actually looks like kind of a rusty spot on a small peach, very hard, green, fuzzy peach. And then eventually the peach will not grow. It'll reach a certain size. It'll start to actually shrivel like a shrunken head, and then out will, of course, the powdery mildew will sporulate. You'll see signs then of the powdery mildew. And at that point, it's over. There's no chance of peaches on that tree. Also causes extensive leaf curling, and again, has to be managed. The beach plums, very interesting. We kind of start the small fruit now as we kind of think about this. And the beach plums are very amazing, I think, because they're native to this region. We get down along the waterfront areas of the bay and, of course, the ocean, and they're very much native. And we've got some really unique nursery selections now. Dr. Rick Uva from Cornell pretty much spent his life's work trying to cultivate some varieties of these beach plums, and we actually have a planting at Upper Marlboro of some of his repository of genetics that he shared with us. He actually lives over on the Eastern Shore now, Dr. Uva, and actually grows out and has named some varieties, so we now have some varieties, named varieties of beach plum. And they're typically kind of like a spreading open bush, and again, on a natural seedling, typically cuttings that are propagated onto that native seedling. And again, there are some nurseries now that have beach plums. And beach plums, again, they come in all different colors. In fact, these are pictures up here that you see the red and the yellow beach plums here. They actually are pictures I took in Upper Marlboro. So we have a lot of different color variation as well as taste and flavor. But that's what they would look like in their native environment on a coastal area. They actually do like the pH to be around 6 to 6.5, but will do fairly fine on low pH. And we typically space them about 6 foot in the row, 15 foot between the row, and fairly shallowly place the roots. So here's a planting at Upper Marlboro, 2003. I just went out and I sprayed some Roundup a couple weeks earlier, and then just popped in these little seedlings. And by the end of the year, they were growing pretty quite well. We have, again, a interesting varietal collection from Dr. Rick U's work at Upper Marlboro. And so here's that picture, that little seedling, just sprayed some Roundup to kill slides, just stuck them in the ground. Really didn't do much, put some fertilizer on them and a little bit of lime and sprayed them a little bit for when, as they go out, make sure there's no insects eating them right up. And they did really well. And they've continued to do quite well in Upper Marlboro. We never did do exactly what I anticipated. They all bloom fairly similar times, a little difference in bloom time, but they are self-fruitful, and they do have a lot of different characteristics, shapes and sizes and colors. By August 2005, so that's 3 years in, they're quite productive. And here they are producing, and you got some yellow ones and purple ones and red ones, different colors. Here's a picture of some beautiful purple, and they make great preserves. And so remember, they're a plum, and they still have that big plum seed in the middle of them, and they're not much bigger than about an inch and an eighth in diameter. So they're pretty much mostly. There's Ben years ago harvesting them. So again, we did some trials on them, and they clean up nice, and they are pretty fruit, and some of them are pretty tasty. And of course, most of them make very good preserves, and that's what they're famous for. Here they are, 2010, and now they're completely overgrown and out of control. But they were extremely productive, and with very little spray. I did spray them for brown rot. I did have a little problem with that, but only a few sprays is all that was required. And of course, when I talk about spray, the bloom sprays are the most critical. So bloom and early cover. If we can just get a few sprays, and of course sanitation and those, very little spray. In fact, they got some really good packaged fruit spray mixtures that I typically recommend, for our home gardeners. And again, so it is fairly minimal, but we do have to have good coverage and good sanitation techniques, but very, very good. Often people say, well, why do we have to do all this spraying? I remember my grandparents, they didn't spray, and we ate fruit. And of course, we did eat fruit with a lot more wormholes, and we tolerated a lot more things back in those days than we're willing to tolerate now. But it is true that we're subject to much more disease now, and it's because of the production. We produce so much more, and it's the likelihood of being isolated away in an area that's truly isolated from the disease spores that are in the air and the insects, because we all throughout our landscape, there is no isolation anymore, and the disease that we typically see is being blown in from the Carolinas, or from Kentucky, from the Gulf Stream air, and so we really don't have this isolation, and so that's why it's very troublesome. And it also means it's very important. I don't know if you know, but 2020 is the year of the plant. And so worldwide, this is the year of the plant. I think in 2015, it was the year of the soils. And I think it's about time it's year of the plant. We think about the importance of protecting ourselves and our pets and maybe our livestock from zoonotic disease, but we typically don't think of the importance of protecting plants. And we really have, I think, a civic responsibility to protect plants in the landscape. And so I would say, therefore, if we're going to plant fruit, we have to be diligent about protecting it from disease, because that disease not only impacts our production, but it will likely impact someone else's production and maybe someone's livelihood. And so, again, this is a civic duty to be responsible and responsive to disease and insect outbreaks again. So that's something to think about, isn't it? Year of the Plant, 2020. Let's get out there in that landscape, and let's do diligence to that. We have a lot of stress out there in our native trees, and all of our resources to disease. And sometimes it's just good to cut and clean and replant and think about that. Sometimes harvest is not a bad idea. And so, again, if we're going to get into fruit production, we need to be diligent about pest management. I think that's the civic responsibility. And so that's why I say start out in those things that you're going to be responsible for before you move into peaches. Let's start with blackberries. The cherries, sweet cherries again, and tart cherries, I still like the open centers. I still think you need to paint the tree trunks. Again, a tree will grow up. To make this an open center now, what we need to do is come in here and cut that center out. Now we have the scaffold development. Some people actually, this tree is actually more being grown as a columnar tree. Some people do like straight up cherry trees, and that's okay. The only problem with that is you will be up on a ladder picking cherries, and that's kind of dangerous. And so that's why I typically like open centers. So cherries are ones that we can grow. Grapes, well, they're really fascinating. We've got, when we think, and I really do, when I think about grapes, reduced spraying is very possible, especially with Labrusca. Labrusca are American grapes, and vinifera are European, right? So vinifera European grapes, Labrusca are American. The cross, Labrusca and vinifera, are hybrids. And the interesting thing about the Labruscas is that all of our table grapes are Labrusca. And so again, very, very important because those typically require less spray. So if we're going to grow grapes, our Labrusca and our hybrids are the better choices for kind of reduced spray approaches. We get into vinifera production, so that's that's the Cabernet Sauvignon and the Chardonnay and typically what we think of the grape French and varietals and things. Those viniferas are much more problematic to disease, things like downy mildew. So I typically, again, not recommended for a kind of a reduced spray approach. So our Concords, our Labruscas, our table grapes, all are what we typically should be growing at a homeowner level because we can go reduced spray. Now I will admit that we probably can go organic blueberry production, and we probably can go organic blackberry production. But we really can't go organic grape production once we get black rot. That's kind of a game changer. So I have worked with some individuals that wanted to stay in production and recognized that they would have to go to a fungicide that was conventional if they wanted to continue the grape production because black rot, even in Labruscas, is that devastating. So again, knowing your disease and then knowing what might be required is very important before you plant some of these things. And these decisions are typically made easily. As we get into grape production, all of them are grafted onto a rootstock, and all the rootstocks are actually Labrusca. And so every grape in the world is now grafted on a Labrusca, an American rootstock. Anyone know why? What did we do to the world? We should never be forgiven for. We think of all the invasive species in the world. Somehow they come to us, right? But we, the Americans, are guilty as anyone. And we allowed the destruction of all the old world vineyards when they took our Labrusca over to the European countries, and they took over, and along with them, an insect. Does anyone know what that insect was? And again, we should never be forgiven for that. So I think everything that comes our way now is just payback, because now all the old world grapes are on Labrusca rootstocks, and it's required. And I'll give you a minute to ponder that. Somebody should be able to think about what we did, that we should never be forgiven for. But anyway, veraison is that period of time when grapes reach their physiological maturity and size, and they're starting the ripening process in that veraison period. And most of our region will happen in southern Maryland. Typically, it happens in mid-August to the last of September, depending on the variety. When we think about grapes, there's a lot of different training systems for grapes, and there's really two types that you need to know, I think, or at least two different types of growth habit that we have with the grapes that we grow. Typically, we think of bilateral cordon vertical shoot positions. That's typically most of our hybrids and our vinifera. So most of our wine grapes that we think of are going to grow on a bilateral cordon, and then vertically position the shoots. We're going to sandwich them between catch bars. And that's what you're seeing in this picture here. That's a bilateral cordon. The cordon is the established wood, and then we're going to position the shoots sandwiched between, and that's the shoot positioning. That's the standard now for wine production. Now, the other one that's very important is the umbrella system, which is the Hudson River High Wire. And that's what we typically think of, kind of the arbor approach. All the Labruscas like to grow down. The vinifers tend to grow up, Chardonnay especially. And then the Labruscas like to kind of weep down. And they also have to be cane pruned, which means we can't prune back to this nice hardwood each year to these single two buds. We have to have a cane or we'll cut away fruitfulness. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So pruning and trellising techniques are very important for the varieties that we choose. And I'll show you some really good examples of how we work through that. But very important is we're going to remove every year back down to some cane portion or down to the cordon, the hardwood, depending on the species. And we typically plant our vines in a rows. I like about 14 foot wide. It's really easy to work with, and about 6 to 8 feet in the row. So 14-foot wide row, 6 to 8 feet in the row. Again, well trellised. And of course, remember what I said, black rot is a real problem. And here's the insect that we took over to Europe, phylloxera, a root-feeding aphid. Our Labrusca rootstocks are tolerant to phylloxera. Conifer grapes, on the other hand, are highly subject to destruction by this insect. So when phylloxera came from the U.S. into the old world, they immediately had to get Labrusca rootstocks over there, graft their varieties on it to get protection. And so again, we should never be forgiven for that. Anything we do is from now on that comes to the U.S. is just payback. Downy mildew is the big problem for our vinifera grapes. Of course, black rot is a problem for all grapes, and once you get black rot, very difficult to overcome. So it's again, that's where I kind of a game changer for those that want to do it organically. They're going to have to throw a few conventional fungicides to get them over that black rot. Then they can go back to organic if they're lucky enough to get full control. And that's again, even with our most resistant grape varieties. Here's our vineyard team pictures. You can see here's a Pinot Noir, and of course the vineyard team doing some pruning snow. Wow, what's that snow? I was out in Napa. Of course, I hope some of you have had a chance to go out in some of the wine countries out west. And of course, we've got some beautiful vineyards here now in Maryland, Virginia. Again, Virginia's the Napa of the East. And here's a picture I took of Robert Madavi's house and his vineyard. Robert's passed on now, but he has a beautiful vineyard. And of course, my wife and I were at Situi's. And so again, really interesting to see the wine industry. There's my daughter, growing up out in Situi. And it really is interesting to see the grape industry here develop. We started the project at Upper Marlboro in 2001. There was 12 wineries. And, I wrote a little vision document and got some grants and put together the team. And we had a lot of time. Here's our first varieties that we put in Upper Marlboro in varietals. And they were every one of there is a vinifera, except there's 2 hybrids, Vidal and Traminette are 2 hybrids in there. And so when I wrote the little vineyard summary and vision document, it was kind of thinking about, what could happen, if doing this transition, we got 40 farmers to produce 5 acres and how much income that could produce. And it was really interesting because I really cut my vision. It was really short-sighted. I never would have believed that we would have got so much vineyard and winery production here in Southern Maryland. In fact, now Calvert County has more wineries than any county in the state. We're now surpassed 100 wineries in Maryland, and so it has been fascinating to see this tremendous explosion. I did a vineyard reckoning document, which was I counted for every hour and every nickel, right down to the penny, amount of money we put in 2 years in establishing the 1.12 acre, 640 vine vineyard at Upper Marlboro. And here it is. It's 634 hours in 2 years, and it's just amazing what all you have to do to put in 1.12 acres. And I valued that at around $9,500 at $15 an hour technician labor. And then, of course, a lot of that labor was us. So again, a lot of time put into that. It's just those 2 years. And then we carried that vineyard on for 16 years, and we actually looked at a total of, I think, 38 different varieties were varietals in that vineyard. And so great learning experience. I remember planting day, and there are 640 vines and about $6,000 in the ground, and you're thinking, holy cow, they look like they're all dead sticks, So, and lo and behold, so that was April the 1st. By April 24th, here they are. They're all coming to life. Got everything in place: the cordon wire, the bamboo training stake, irrigation, herbicides, fertility. Everything's kind of right there. Here we are putting these. You can see a couple weeks later, they actually had 100% survival and growth. So it really was pleasantly surprised about how easy it was to establish a vineyard. And then here we are, unbelievable, by June, the 20th, the end of June. There's Herb and there's Ben, and we're all hitting the vineyard. We're working like crazy just to get the cordon established. If we can get the cordon established in that permanent structure on the cordon wire, we can then think about fruiting the second year. And we did that on every variety, which was amazing. There's Ben. Ben looks a little younger than me. And then, and we're all younger then. And again, by the time we got to field day at the end of the middle of 25th of July there in 2001, we could look across and say, lo and behold, there we have a vineyard. So it was really kind of fascinating. There's Herb. And here when we talk about that vineyard, we talk about that cordon. We're trying to grow up 2 trunks and come across and produce this fruiting, kind of a fruiting wire where we have a hard cordon. We're going to cut back to 2 buds on vinifera varieties only. We cut back to 2 buds each year. And so again, that's how we would do in that pruning session. Now, on hybrids and Labruscas, we can't cut back to 2 buds like that. We have to have a fruiting cane because the fruit buds aren't down here. Those buds aren't fruitful down there at the cordon. They're only fruitful about 8 to 12 inches away from the cordon. So again, very important to know that distinction. Or you cut off all your fruit every year. So again, here we are actually doing pruning, going through the vineyard, and it's a nice, great teaching moment. There's Dr. Joe Fiola in there. Everyone's learning how to prune. Of course, I'm a weed expert, so you can see I lay herbicides down and keep things nice and clean. So this would be 3rd year full production vineyard. You can see now the bud's going to break, and they're going to go up and grow up between those catch wires. So here's the bud break, and then you come back a few weeks later, and already you got shoots going up through the catch wires. And then you come back a little bit later, now you got fruit in there already on the cordon, and the shoot's well positioned. So that's what kind of growth, if you took the leaves off, would look like every year. And we did look at different training systems, a divided canopy, smart dicing, and VSP, vertical shoot position for our vineyard. And there's our Chardonnay. Isn't that pretty? You can see now that well-established cordon wood that we cut back to in this year's shoot, and there's the fruit coming off pretty close to the cordon. Again, if we would have cut that close on Labrusco, or if we'd had no fruit, because all the fruit would end up being higher on that fruit wire. This is Pinot, no, Cabernet Franc, and this is Pinot Noir. There's Pinot Gris. So again, very, really neat to see all these different varieties and learn and share a lot of this with a lot of growers over time. Here I am actually looking at bricks. We want 22% sugar in it to reach naturally, and good acid and good pH content, and then we can make a good 11 to 12% alcohol wine. It's kind of the goal. There's Joe. He has up at Keedysville. If you ever get a chance to visit his little viticulture lab there, it's just wonderful. He's got all kinds. We've got 6 research vineyards and a lot of different varietals around the state. Again, Upper Marlboro, we have ceased that operation where we're thinking about replanting. We just don't know which direction to go right there. But we did a lot of work over the years there, and so really fantastic. Now here's the Hudson River High Wire. This is how we grow our Labruscas. Of course, the old traditional arbor system. You think of arbors with our table grapes and our Labrusca type American grapes. So here we have a 6-foot high cordon. This is May 2005. The plants are in. We got a longer bamboo stake. We got the trickle irrigation. So they're actually growing there. We've got our vines out there starting to grow. We came back by that same September, and we've actually established cordons. They come and they touch each other. So then we have basically a chance for fruiting wire. We're going to prune, and instead of pruning up here to 2 buds, we're going to let these little cane pieces, because our fruit's going to be about 8 to 12 inches off that established hard cordon. Cordon wood actually becomes kind of woody. You can tell it becomes woody over time, and you can see that woody cordon, and you can see the cane. You can see where the grapes are. They're about 8 inches off, and this is the next year. So this is the very next year with 1 foot, basically a cluster of Maltite grapes. And so very interesting about this type of grapes. Again, by the by year 2006, we're going to put another cluster in there so that there will be a cluster about every 6 inches across there. Very productive, very quickly. If we allow them to be, if we give them water, allow them to get that cordon growth that first year. Again, water is the most essential, weed-free, nutrition, all those things, proper soil fertility, all those things are critical to that. This was one of my absolute favorite grapes. It's called Vanessa. And again, just that taste. It's not a slip skin. It's got that perfect pop and crunch. It's just fascinating, fabulous to actually eat. Anything, any fruit grown that's ripened on the vine, there's just nothing to quite describe it. And so again, just unbelievable. The blueberries are, again, another wonderful choice for us. And I think, probably other than the requirement for the absolute perfection in the soil preparation, if we're willing to do that, I mean, they have to be pampered basically at the root zone. And if we can do that, we will have success with blueberries. And so I recommend that we grow Southern High Bush. O'Neill, Legacy, Chandler, absolutely would be my first choices. I would also put in a few of the high bush varieties, maybe Elliott, Patriot, Duke. I would stay away from the Blue Clop, Blue Ray, more of the traditional New Jersey varieties. We're just too warm for them. And I would put in a couple Rabbit Eye varieties like Premier, Brightwell, Tifton Blue, Climax. And so, again, Brightwell probably being my favorite there. Legacy O'Neill, my favorite in the Southern High Bush. Maybe Elliott, Patriot, Spartan, something like that, the blue crop. So again, then we have a nice long season of fruiting for our blueberries. They are the difficulty is this pH. We have to make sure that if we are planting blueberries where there has been lime added and the pH is above 5, we've got to acidify that soil. That pH range absolutely needs. Our goal should be 4.8. And so native pH in our area, I'll find native blueberries, low bush blueberries, all over the place. I live up here around Annapolis, and they're just everywhere, up and down my driveway. I'll see them every year blooming. Typically, don't get too many berries because typically they'll be eaten green by the birds. But every now and then I'll get a chance to get a small berry, a few small berries. But you'll notice that our native pH is probably right around 4 or 5 on that fringe between the woods where the wood meets the field. And that's where they're going to be. They're going to be very shallow rooted. Typically will not go below 6 inches. So that's why they have to be pampered. That root zone can't dry out, and it can't get too hot, and it can't get too wet. It's easy to drown the blueberry too. So everything has to be just right. I don't recommend raised beds unless the field is likely to flood, and it still might not be the best location for blueberries. You want good, well-drained soil with high organic matter, with a good mulch layer, so that it just stays moist and doesn't completely dry out. And at the same time, that acidity. We might have to use sulfur for a year or two to get the pH in the right range. So we actually acidify the soil with elemental sulfur. And so getting that soil perfectly right is the goal. Don't ever typically add. I also like the soil, the roots to be in soil and not to be in mulch. And so you want mineral soil, the native mineral soil, mixed in about 1 to 5 ratio. So no more than 20, 25% mulch should ever be mixed in at one time. The acidity's right. You put the soil, you spread the roots very nicely in that. Real nice soil, exclusion of air, nice roots. Keep the roots wet, and that's true of all your fruit. Have your fruit in a bucket of water, even while you're planting, so they're not drying out. They're staying really well saturated. Get them in the soil, get them in the area, manipulate it in that 3 to 4 inch range, typically where most of those roots, and then make sure they're in that soil and organic mixture, and then put heavy layers of mulch and sawdust on top. And then a trickle tape, really critical because you're going to want to keep that soil nice and moist, and at the same time keep it cool with sawdust and mulches. If you do it right, those blueberries will just be phenomenal in their growth. And so here's a picture from June 2005. We put blueberries in, and again, real nice amendment of that root zone. We got a trickle tape in there. We got mulch and sawdust heaped over top. So everything done right. We actually did sulfur to get that down. By the end of that year, you can actually start to see the rabbit eyes and the Southern High Bush starting to really pop out there in that landscape. There's about 14 different blueberry varieties there. By 2007, we're in production, and you can see that looks like legacy right there in the front. And so we're starting to see amazing growth of those southern high bush and those rabbit eye varieties. One of the big problems we have with blueberries is birds, but there is mummyberry disease, and then there are some fruit worms, but typically nothing that can't be controlled with a simple organic approach, organic insecticide. Very easy to control that. And again, netting. I don't you can see the netting on there, but netting for birds is probably the biggest problem. In New Jersey, they know that where they grow blueberries in the pine barrens, they know that birds get 20%. When 20% of 4,000 or 5,000 acres, who really cares, right? But when they come into your blueberry plot, they're not going to take 20%. They're going to take 100%. so that's the problem. We have to bird net on our small scale production fields. They will take all of it. We don't have the luxury of allowing them to take to their satisfaction. Again, blueberries are a crop that I would recommend from an organic standpoint. This is a picture of Blacksburg, Virginia. This is Rabbit Eye Variety Premier. It's one of my favorites. And again, that's about a 12-year-old blueberry bush. They can really do quite well in our heat. And this is at Blackstone, just as hot as Southern Maryland. And so there's no reason. This is O'Neill, a beautiful blueberry. When you get a blueberry that's over an inch in size, again, that's good pollination. And here's the backbone, O'Neill legacy of the backbone of the blueberry industry in the Carolinas. Again, just wonderful, fabulous flavor as well as size. Nothing quite compares to them. The brambles are also very important because they are native. Just like the blueberries are native, the beach plums, the brambles are native to our region. And again, very easy. The blackberries are by far the easiest crop to grow. And there's two different, when we talk about blackberries and raspberries, we talk about floricanes and primocanes. And so we have to understand this distinction. The floricanes are the June bearers. And essentially, what that means is that's the second year of growth of that cane. The first year, when it was a primocane, it was just all vegetative for that first year. And then that allows it to bloom very early in the spring, so it transitions during the dormant period to actually the tail end of the summer season from a primocane into a floricane, and then blooms the following spring. So June bearing, whether it's a blackberry or raspberry or black raspberry, they all are going to essentially be 1 year growth vegetatively, and then we fruit the second year. So we're actually going to trellis them permanently and separate each year out. So we kind of alternate the side of the trellis, primocane, floricane, right? And they produce on the floricane side. And we think of those traditional as what we see on the roadside, our traditional June-bearing blackberries. Then we get into fall-bearing, and we have fall-bearing raspberries as well as fall-bearing blackberries now. And that are really interesting because that allows us to essentially in the same season start out at the beginning of the year right from ground level and grow a primocane, and then about middle of the year it switches to a floricane and flowers, and then we get fall bearing, and that fall bearing can start as early as late August and go all the way into the frost. And so fall bearing is really a wonderful way. And now that we have fall bearing blackberries, Freedom is the first thornless ones. It's just fabulous. And so these are all out in the Arkansas breed program. And so again, now we have fall bearing blackberries, raspberries, and we also have June bearing blackberries and raspberries. And so from a standpoint of trellising, let's take a look at the trellising difference. One thing for sure, the only reason why blackberries out there and our native blackberries aren't really productive is because they all have virus in them. So we want to make sure when we buy our plants, we're getting them propagated from a certified virus-free nursery. Because the last thing we want is plants with virus. That means they're smaller and unproductive. The blackberries that we have, that's also a good reason we want to control before we plant our blackberries and raspberries any wild ones that are around, because we're likely to get that virus vectored into our new planting, and hence we'll have subpar production. So first thing we do out there is the year before we go out and kill all the blackberries and brambles that are currently there in the vicinity, and then we're prepared for our planting the next spring. And so the difference in the training systems are one is permanent and one is basically just an annual training trellis system. So basically temporary trellis system and then a permanent one. The permanent one, there's a picture here of this A picture. You can see that we can separate then last year's primocane and then the new primocane that's growing this year, right? So again, in the spring of the year, there would only be one cane up there. By the time we get to fall, we're going to have the one that fruited, which we'll cut off, and then the one that we grew for the next year, right? So we're kind of constantly alternating. Regardless of, that's so critically important with all the brambles is once they flower, we need to cut them off. They need to be cut to the crown within about 3 inches of the crown. And that's really critical for disease control. That's the reason why I don't recommend raspberries first, because of a disease called cane blight. There's two of them actually, spur blight and cane blight, that get on raspberries, and it's almost always caused by not cutting off the fruited cane. And so we're always cutting off the fruited cane. Once it's fruited, it's done. And that's so with the floricane varieties, we're alternating the primocane that grew that summer. And then once we get the floricane that's fruited and done, we cut that off, and then that primocane becomes the floricane next year. And we go back and forth with a permanent structure. Now with the fall bearers, we're fortunate that we just put up a temporary trellis. We cut them off clean to the ground every fall because they fruit every year. And then we go ahead and we put our trellis in the spring, and we allow them to grow up. And about midsummer, they flower, and then mid to late summer, and then we get into fall bearing. And then, of course, once they fruited, we just can take the trellis down and sometimes just run a mower or just go through and cut them all down nice to close to the crown. And because of that, with our fall bearers, they're much easier to grow disease-free because we cannot leave those canes in there that have fruited on raspberries without getting disease carried over. So that's why I say blackberries are much easier. Or fall-bearing raspberries would be one that I would highly recommend, as long as we're willing to cut those fruited canes off. The big problems that we have, cane blight, spur blight, real big problems for our raspberries. Again, we overcome that by cutting off fruited canes and by using a little bit of fungicides when needed. There are some insects, but typically not many problems. Blackberries typically very easy to fruit, as long as we do a good job with our cutting out of the fruited canes. We really do keep a nice looking blackberry trellis. There's one disease that you do have to watch out in blackberries, and this is called orange rust. It's a systemic rust disease. You can see I blew up a picture of this. Is a picture here with the arrow, where you see the plants are typically missing. They're not missing, they're just dwarfed, and they got this orange rust on them. We need to dig them out, roots and all, take a mattock and everything, and get those, bag them up, get them landfilled, or put them in a burn pile and burn them. We don't want to continue allow that sporulation to continue. Sometimes this will come from the nursery, and so we really have to be diligent and watch for it. This is a temporary trellis, where they use a T-bar with some twine, and that growth is all from the beginning of the spring going into the fall now in production. So again, that'll all get mowed again. This is a permanent structure of both blackberries on this side, raspberries on this side, and this is cane blight and spur blight. They did not cut off the fruiting canes, and so next year, those fruiting canes were highly diseased. These are the canes that had fruited, and they infected the entire raspberry new shoots, and essentially they wiped out that raspberry field by the neglect of not cutting, of course, not using fungicides. We'll finish up with strawberries. Been at this long enough, I think. I hope we're all hanging in there. I think I've answered most of the questions there. The problem with the wineberries, disease problems, I'm not too sure about that one. I would just err on the caution and probably control them. I don't think they do carry the same diseases, the viral diseases. At least they don't look like it. The kiwi vines, of course, male, female kiwis. I play with them a little bit. They're kind of difficult, but they can grow. Can't really get into that right now, but again, as long as you have the male, female plants, and they're quite productive. I've seen some pretty nice production with kiwis. Little strawberries. Other little berry will finish up with strawberries. Again, There are varieties recommended for reduced spray approach. I do think the annual systems is very much a system that probably can be done where we use bare root plants in the fall, put them in high towers and patio type planting situation, planters and things of that nature can be very productive. Of course, plastic culture is a system that I would recommend if we're going to do it in the field or in a small garden area. And we put in our fall plants every fall. And that way, we typically don't need quite the spray program that we would need if we're going to carry the berries over like a matted row traditional. And so from an organic standpoint, I would think these annual systems would work very well. And we do have some really nice varieties. Early Glow is kind of the standard matted row, but we have Honey Eye All-Star. I actually updated the variety list in your handout. We do have some new everbearing day neutral varieties that allow us to flower in cooler settings. And of course, that's hard to find sometimes in Southern Maryland, but we can manipulate the environment with shade cloth and misters, and they start doing a little bit of everbearing type of plants. And of course, the plastic culture system is the annual system. Flavor Star and All-Star Camarosa Chandler are probably the ones that we typically think of. Actually, Flavor Fest is a new one. It's probably one that's important to try too. The annual systems we plant in the fall, we typically harvest end of April through to even the end of May in some of these systems, these annual systems. Matted row and plastic culture, different plant spacings there. I do recommend trickle tape for both. Row covers for the plastic culture system are very important. And again, these can be very productive. The problems with our strawberries, botrytis, we do typically, like I say, bloom sprays. Blooming and early berry development, maybe just a couple sprays is all we need to control botrytis and anthracnose. Red steel is a phytophthora problem. That's really only problematic in matted row perennial strawberry systems. And so red steel is phytophthora. We can avoid that by having well-drained areas. And again, there are a few products that we can use that are organic for that. Strawberry clipper beetle, very interesting insect to watch out for. It's another one of those weevils. It lives in the woods, finds your strawberries when they're blooming, and actually likes to clip off the bloom and kind of lick the little nectar, kind of like maybe if you ever eat a honeysuckle, kind of the same way. They kind of have fun in that. They'll take all your flowers off, and before you know it, lose all your berry production. So again, we watch out for that. And spider mites are very problematic too. So again, just a little bit of diligence, and it's all it's needed, I think, to do pretty good with strawberries. This is Alton Galloway. He's past Callahan down at Cherry Hill Orchard. Of course, that's all housing development now, but there's a beautiful 5-acre strawberry field. Amazing to come down and see that kind of productivity and think about the amount of fruit that can be produced. Last thing I want to share with you before we adjourn tonight is maybe think about reading up on pesticide application. It's very important in fruit production, whether organic or conventional approaches, to be on top of your to have success. And so our farmers are certified pesticide applicators. Maybe master gardeners should think about reading the core manual and maybe taking a test to become a little bit more understanding about the use of pesticides and why our farmers make the decisions that they do out there. Of course, if you're ever interested in a label, to look at a product, whether it's organic or conventional, cdms.net is a great website. So CDMS, Chemical Data Management System, you can actually look up, and as long as you can spell the product, in this case you use the product name, you can find a label for anything that's labeled under EPA for use in the USA. And here's my office. It's up at the Naval Academy Dairy Farm. And we took one of the old milk barns and turned it into our office. There's what it looked like in 1924. So come on up and visit me in the office. You might want to come to our website. And it's interesting to look back. Actually, I worked up at the Naval Academy as an agronomist for 18 years. That's my boy, my oldest one, when he would help me feed the cows on the backside of what now is the extension office. So it's interesting kind of turn of events. There's my website. Again, I do have the slide presentation in a PDF form there. I will have this recording for you to look at. And for those that did not have a chance to make it, I don't know, Mariah, are you still hanging in there?
Yep.
Got any final words for the group? I think we reached enough here tonight. It always wears me out to talk about all this fruit.
Oh, yeah. Well, my final words are thank you so much. This was really informative. I'm not really sure what else to say. I'll message you guys. I'll email you the recording.
I see a question there from Douglas that says, where's the best place to buy whips? Most of the nurseries, you want a 2 or 3 year whip. And so they're usually the cheapest tree to buy too. You should be able to get them if you buy 25 or more. You typically can get them for about $9 a piece, or less. And so Adams County Nursery, Starks, some of the big millers, some of the big suppliers will sell you whip trees. That's what you want. Yep. Any other questions? Great to have everybody on board. I know it's a lot of fruit, a lot of information. Toads burying in my blueberries. Yeah, I really don't know that they cause any harm. There's certainly a lot of them out there. I can't think of anything that they would do to hurt anything.
Yeah, unless you see any damage that they're causing, they wouldn't disturb the roots, would they?
No, they wouldn't. I mean, just the digging, maybe. I don't think they would really do any harm. They're insect eaters.
Yeah.
So,
they're probably just getting a little shelter under the soil.
Yeah, I wouldn't be too concerned about them. Toads are not problematic to the fruit. Tastes like chicken. There you go. Latex is just general, regular old latex, right? Thickest you can buy. Put it on there, thick and heavy. Yeah, won't hurt a thing. All righty. Well, I guess we'll call tonight then.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, I'll send it. It'll take a while for this recording to be available, but as soon as it's available, I'll send it to you, Mariah.
Okay, thank you.
Probably tomorrow.
Okay, cool. I was just about to ask. Thank you so much.
You bet. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Enjoy becoming a master gardener, and take to heart the idea that you're educators from the University of Maryland, and I appreciate everything you do. Good night.
You too. Thank you.
Yeah. Good night.
Right.